I'm Major Chelsea Brooks, 32, and I built my career from ROTC nobody to leading troops in the Air Force. For years, I backed my cousin Tyler, coaching him, supporting him, helping him become the Marine he wanted to be. But when he tried to humiliate me in front of our whole family at a backyard barbecue, I made a choice that flipped our relationship on its head. Ever been dismissed or blindsided by someone you poured everything into? If you have, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I break down what happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to defend your dignity after being pushed too far, hit like and subscribe. What happened next surprised all of us. I grew up close to my cousin Tyler. We were only a year apart, me older, but that gap never really mattered when we were kids. We played the same games, climbed the same trees, got in the same kind of trouble. Our families lived 20 minutes apart, so weekends meant sleepovers, bike rides, and long summer days that stretched until the fireflies came out. Tyler was always competitive. He wanted to win at everything: board games, basketball, even who could hold their breath longer underwater. I was quieter, more disciplined. I didn't need to win every time, but when I set my mind to something, I followed through. Our family had a way of framing us. Tyler was the athletic one. I was the book-smart one. It was never mean-spirited, just the way relatives talked. He got praise for scoring touchdowns in high school. I got praise for my GPA and my acceptance into ROTC. We existed in separate lanes, and for a long time, that worked. I joined the Air Force through ROTC in college. I commissioned as a second lieutenant at 23, right after graduation. The ceremony was small, formal, and my family came out to watch. Tyler was there too, 17 at the time, still figuring out what he wanted to do after high school. He seemed proud of me that day. He asked questions about the uniform, the rank, what came next. I answered them all, patient and thorough, the way I always did with him. My career moved steadily. I put in the work, stayed focused, and progressed through the ranks. By my late 20s, I was a captain. The promotion to major came when I was 32. I was assigned to security forces, then later to special operations support. That's where I learned advanced defensive tactics, close quarters control techniques, and how to neutralize a threat without escalating to lethal force. It wasn't about being tough. It was about being precise. Every movement had a purpose. Every technique had a reason. I trained regularly, not for show, but because my role required it. Tyler enlisted in the Marines when he turned 18. It was a good decision for him. He needed structure, direction, something to channel all that restless energy. When he came home after boot camp, he was different. Straighter posture. Sharper tone. He wore his uniform to family gatherings even when it wasn't required. He referred to himself as infantry, even though he was still a private first class, an E2 working his way toward E3. He had earned the title of Marine, and I respected that. But there was a new edge to him, something I hadn't seen before. He talked about boot camp like it was the hardest thing anyone had ever done. He made jokes about other branches, especially the Air Force. Chair Force, he'd call it, laughing. Flyboys. Soft. I let it slide. Rivalry between branches was normal. It didn't bother me. But over time, I started noticing a pattern. I had helped Tyler a lot over the years. When he was preparing to enlist, I proofread his paperwork. I coached him through PT when he was struggling to meet the minimums. I drove him to appointments when his car broke down. I paid for gear he forgot to bring to training. He relied on me, and I didn't mind. That's what family does. But he never acknowledged it. Not once. He'd accept the help, say thanks in passing, then move on like it was owed to him. And when he talked about his accomplishments, he made it sound like he'd done everything alone. I didn't need credit. I wasn't keeping score. But the lack of recognition started to sting after a while. Especially when he began brushing off my real experience. He'd listen to my stories about training exercises or deployments, then change the subject or make a joke. As if what I did didn't count. As if being an officer meant I didn't know what real work looked like. The family planned a big summer barbecue after months of everyone being scattered. It was going to be at Uncle James's place, the usual spot for gatherings. Lots of food, lots of people, the kind of event where everyone caught up and kids ran around the yard until dark. I knew Tyler would be there. I hadn't seen him in a while. I expected some of the usual bravado, the Marine pride, maybe a few jokes at my expense. I didn't expect anything dramatic. I figured we'd talk, eat, and go home. That's how these things usually went. I was looking forward to it, honestly. I missed the version of Tyler I used to know, the one who wasn't trying so hard to prove something. But in the weeks leading up to the barbecue, I started noticing a shift. His texts were different. Short. Dismissive. When I asked how he was doing, he'd send back one-word answers. When I mentioned something about work, he'd ignore it or reply with something sarcastic. He posted on social media a lot, mostly photos from training or nights out with other Marines. The captions were always about toughness, brotherhood, being part of the few and the proud. I didn't mind the pride. I understood it. But there was an undertone that felt new. A need to be seen as superior. Not just proud, but better than everyone else. Better than other branches. Better than people who hadn't done what he'd done. Better than me. I tried to give him grace. He was 19. He was finding his identity. The Marines had given him something to belong to, and he was holding onto it tightly. That made sense. But the way he talked to me started to cross a line. He called me chair force in a group text with other family members. He made a joke about officers not knowing combat, even though I'd been in situations he couldn't imagine. He rewrote childhood memories, making himself the hero and me the sidekick. If I corrected him gently, he'd roll his eyes and say something like, "Relax, Major. Not everything has to be by the book." The tone wasn't playful anymore. It was condescending. A week before the barbecue, he called me a fragile officer type. It was in response to something minor, something I don't even remember now. But the phrase stuck with me. Fragile. As if I hadn't earned everything I had. As if my rank was handed to me. As if I didn't train, didn't lead, didn't serve. I didn't respond. I let it go. But I knew something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if it could be fixed. The early signs of Tyler's new arrogance weren't loud. They were small, scattered across conversations and interactions that I might have dismissed if I hadn't been paying attention. But I was paying attention. I'd known him his whole life. I could tell when something was off. His replies to my messages became clipped, almost robotic. If I asked how training was going, he'd say, "Good." If I asked what he'd been up to, he'd say, "Nothing much." No details. No warmth. Just enough to technically respond without actually engaging. It felt like he was putting distance between us on purpose, like he didn't want to let me in anymore. I told myself he was busy. New Marines are always busy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. He started bragging about boot camp in a way that felt performative. Not just proud, but superior. He'd talk about how hard it was, how most people couldn't handle it, how the Marines were the toughest branch by far. He'd say things like, "You wouldn't understand unless you've been through it." I never challenged him on it. I had no reason to, but it bothered me that he seemed to think his experience was the only one that mattered. I'd been through officer training, advanced combat courses, live-fire exercises, deployments. I'd led teams in high-stress environments where mistakes cost lives. But to him, none of that counted. Because I was Air Force. Because I was an officer. Because I didn't fit his narrow definition of what a warrior looked like. He spent more time with other young Marines, guys fresh out of boot camp or still in their first year of service. They hyped each other up constantly. I saw it in the group photos, the comments on social media, the way they talked. They repeated the same lines over and over. Officers don't know combat. Air Force has it soft. We're the real warriors. It was tribal, and Tyler bought into it completely. He started parroting those lines at family gatherings. If someone asked about my work, he'd interject with a joke. "Oh, she sits in an office all day. She probably gets coffee breaks. Not like us grunts." People laughed. It was framed as teasing, as branch rivalry, as harmless fun. But it wasn't harmless. It was dismissive. It was disrespectful. And it was constant. The family dynamics started to worsen. Tyler became the center of attention at every gathering. He told exaggerated stories, and people ate them up. He described training exercises like they were combat missions. He'd talk about drill instructors like they were mythical figures. He'd make it sound like he'd been through hell and come out the other side. And maybe, in his mind, he had. But the way he told those stories left no room for anyone else's experience. Especially not mine. If I tried to add context, to explain how training worked across different branches, he'd cut me off. "Relax, Major. Not everything has to be by the book." If I shared a story from my own career, he'd laugh it off or change the subject. It was like he couldn't stand the idea that I had done things he hadn't. That I had authority he didn't. That I outranked him. He started rewriting our childhood. In his version of events, he was always the one who came up with the ideas, who took the risks, who led the way. I was the one who followed, who played it safe, who needed looking after. That wasn't how I remembered it. But he told those stories so confidently that other family members started to believe them. I became the sidekick in my own memories. Any accomplishment of mine was downgraded. If someone mentioned my promotion to major, he'd say, "Yeah, but she's Air Force." If someone asked about my deployments, he'd say, "Not like real combat zones." He never said these things with malice. He said them with a smile, like it was all in good fun. But it wasn't fun. It was erasure. I tried to talk to him about it once. I called him a few days before the barbecue and asked if everything was okay. He said everything was fine. I said he seemed distant. He said he was just busy. I said I felt like he didn't respect what I did anymore. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but a dismissive one. "Come on," he said. "Don't be so sensitive. It's just jokes." I told him it didn't feel like jokes. He sighed, the kind of sigh that said he was done with the conversation. "Look, I'm proud of you, okay? But you gotta admit, Air Force isn't exactly frontline stuff." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He believed what he believed, and nothing I said was going to change that. The key moment came a week before the barbecue. We were texting about logistics, who was bringing what time people were arriving. Out of nowhere, he said, "You should come early. I'll show you some moves. Might toughen you up a bit." I stared at the message for a long time. Might toughen you up. As if I needed toughening. As if I hadn't been through more than he could imagine. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I just sent back, "I'll be there at 1400. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was it. No recognition of what he'd just said. No awareness of how condescending it sounded. Just a thumbs up. I put my phone down and sat in the silence of my apartment, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not hurt. Something colder. A realization that the cousin I grew up with, the one I'd helped and supported and cared about, didn't see me as an equal anymore. He saw me as less. And I didn't know if I could fix that. The barbecue started the way these things always did. Uncle James's backyard was full of people by the time I arrived at 1400. Kids ran through the grass, adults stood in clusters talking and laughing, and the smell of burgers and ribs filled the air. I parked on the street, grabbed the potato salad I'd made, and walked through the side gate. A few relatives waved. I waved back. Everything felt normal. Comfortable. I wasn't expecting trouble. Tyler was already there. I saw him near the grill, talking to a group of younger cousins. He had his Marine Corps t-shirt on, the one with the eagle, globe, and anchor across the chest. His posture was different than it used to be. Straighter. More rigid. He looked like he was performing even when he wasn't doing anything. When he saw me, he grinned and raised his hand. I nodded back. No tension yet. Just family. I spent the first hour catching up with relatives. My Aunt Marissa asked about work. I kept it vague, the way I always did. Uncle James asked if I was seeing anyone. I deflected with a joke. Colonel Reeves, my mentor, had taught me early on that family gatherings weren't the place to talk shop. People didn't really want to know what I did. They wanted to feel like they knew. So I gave them enough to satisfy their curiosity and moved on. Tyler, on the other hand, was holding court. He demonstrated some hand-to-hand move on one of our younger cousins, a kid maybe 16. The kid went down easy, laughing, and everyone clapped. Tyler stood up, chest puffed, smiling wide. He was eating it up. I watched from a distance, sipping a soda, saying nothing. Then he called me out. "Hey, Major." His voice cut through the noise. Everyone turned to look. He was still grinning, but there was something else in his eyes. A challenge. "Come on. Let's spar. I'll go easy on you." A few people laughed. I stayed where I was, calm, assessing. "I'm good," I said. "Thanks, though." He shook his head, still smiling. "Come on. Don't be like that. It'll be fun." He took a step toward me. "I promise I won't break a nail." More laughter. Louder this time. I felt the shift in the air. This wasn't just him being playful. This was him trying to prove something in front of everyone. I set my drink down on the nearest table. Tyler, this isn't a good idea. He ignored me. Air Force officers can't handle contact, huh? That's what I heard. He was still smiling, but his tone had an edge now. A few people looked uncomfortable. Most just watched, curious to see what would happen. I stayed calm. I'd been in situations like this before. Not at family barbecues, but in training and evaluations, in moments where someone wanted to test me. The key was not to react emotionally. The key was to stay in control. I'm not doing this, I said. Firm, but not aggressive. He laughed, louder now. See? Soft. Then he lunged. No warning. No setup. Just a full aggressive move, like he was trying to tackle me. My training kicked in before I even had time to think. I sidestepped, redirected his momentum, and locked my arm around his neck from behind. In one fluid motion, I took him to the ground. He went face first into the dirt, his arms scrambling for purchase. I controlled the descent, made sure he didn't hit hard enough to get hurt, but hard enough to understand what had just happened. I secured the rear naked choke, my forearm across his throat, my other hand braced behind his head. Not tight enough to cut off air completely, but tight enough that he couldn't move. The yard went silent. Tap out, I said. My voice was calm, almost quiet. Or go to sleep. He tried to resist. I felt him tense, felt him try to twist out of it. But I had position, leverage, and years of training he didn't. He wasn't going anywhere. His breathing got faster, more panicked. I didn't tighten the hold. I didn't need to. I just waited. After a few seconds, he tapped my arm. 3 quick pats. The universal signal. I released him immediately, stood up, and stepped back. He stayed on the ground for a moment, coughing, dizzy, his face red. When he finally stood, he wouldn't look at me. He brushed the dirt off his shirt, his hands shaking slightly. No one said anything. A few people stared at me like I'd crossed a line. A few stared at Tyler like they didn't know what to think. Most just looked uncomfortable. I walked over to where I'd left my drink, picked it up, and took a sip. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was normal. I hadn't lost control. I hadn't done anything wrong. Tyler had lunged at me without consent, and I'd responded the way I was trained to respond. That was it. But I knew how it looked. I knew how people would talk about it later. Tyler stood near the grill, avoiding eye contact with everyone. His face was still flushed. One of the younger cousins asked if he was okay. He nodded, said he was fine, and walked toward the house. I watched him go. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything, really. Just tired. Tired of proving myself. Tired of being disrespected. Tired of holding back for the sake of someone who wouldn't do the same for me. Aunt Marissa came over a few minutes later. Her face was tight, worried. What happened? She asked. I told her the truth. Tyler lunged at me. I defended myself. She frowned, glanced toward the house, then back at me. He's young, she said. He didn't mean anything by it. I didn't argue. There was no point. She wasn't going to see it from my side. Not today. Maybe not ever. Uncle James approached next. He didn't say much, just put a hand on my shoulder and nodded. I appreciated that. He understood, even if he didn't say it out loud. The rest of the barbecue was awkward. People tried to go back to normal, but the energy had shifted. I stayed for another hour, mostly out of politeness, then said my goodbyes and left. As I drove home, I replayed the moment in my mind. Not the takedown, but the moment before. The moment Tyler lunged. The moment he chose to disrespect me in front of everyone. That was the betrayal. Not the sparring. Not the choke. The choice he made to treat me like I was less than him. And the realization that I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. The fallout started almost immediately. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing. Group texts. Private messages. Missed calls. I ignored most of them. I wasn't in the mood to explain myself over and over, to defend a decision I didn't regret. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on my couch, and let the silence settle around me. Eventually, I checked the messages. They were split. Some family members thought Tyler needed the lesson. He's been cocky lately, one cousin wrote. Maybe this'll humble him. Others thought I'd embarrassed him. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," Aunt Marissa texted. "He's just a kid." I didn't respond to either camp. I wasn't interested in litigating what happened. Tyler had lunged at me. I'd defended myself. That was the whole story. Tyler went silent. Completely. I sent him a message the next day, just checking in, seeing if he was okay. No response. I waited 2 days, then tried again. Nothing. I asked Aunt Marissa if she'd heard from him. She said he was fine, just embarrassed, and that I should give him space. I did. But the silence stretched on. Days turned into a week. A week turned into 2. I heard through the family grapevine that he was telling people I'd attacked him. That I'd gone too far. That I'd used excessive force. None of that was true, but the narrative was already forming. In his version of events, I was the aggressor. He was the victim. And because he was younger, because he was a Marine, because he was family, people wanted to believe him. I started looking at the pattern. Not just the barbecue, but everything that had led up to it. Years of me helping him. Years of me being there when he needed something. Proofing his enlistment paperwork. Coaching him through PT when he was struggling. Driving him to appointments. Paying for gear he forgot. Listening to his complaints. Celebrating his wins. I'd been his support system, and he'd taken it all for granted. Not just taken it for granted, erased it. He rewrote the story so that he'd done everything on his own, so that I was just a background character in his life. And when I finally stood up for myself, when I finally set a boundary, he couldn't handle it. He turned me into the villain because it was easier than admitting he'd been wrong. I talked to Captain Lydia Tran about it. Lydia was someone I trusted, someone who understood both the military side and the personal side of things like this. We met for coffee one afternoon, and I told her the whole story. She listened without interrupting, nodding in the right places, her face neutral. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee, thinking. Then she said, "You didn't hurt him. You revealed him." I looked at her, waiting for her to explain. "He wanted to prove he was tougher than you," she continued. "He wanted to humiliate you in front of your family. And when that didn't work, when you showed him exactly what you're capable of, he couldn't handle it. So now he's rewriting the story to make himself the victim." She took a sip of her coffee. "That's not on you. That's on him." Her words stuck with me. "You didn't hurt him. You revealed him." That felt true. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd defended myself. I'd used the exact amount of force necessary to neutralize a threat without causing harm. Tyler wasn't injured. He wasn't traumatized. He was embarrassed. And instead of dealing with that embarrassment like an adult, he was lashing out. I felt something shift in my mindset. For years, I'd bent over backward to maintain our relationship. I'd tolerated the disrespect, the condescension, the erasure of my accomplishments. I'd told myself it was just how he was, that he'd grow out of it, that family was more important than pride. But I was done. I didn't need to keep proving my loyalty to someone who didn't respect me. I didn't need to keep making excuses for someone who refused to see me as an equal. The family pressure didn't stop. Aunt Marissa called me a few days later. She was gentle, careful, but her message was clear. "He's young," she said again. "He made a mistake. Can't you just let it go?" I told her I wasn't holding a grudge. I told her Tyler lunged at me, and I defended myself. She sighed. "I know. But you're older. You're more experienced. Couldn't you have just walked away?" I thought about that. Could I have walked away? Maybe. But why should I? Why was it my responsibility to de-escalate a situation he created? Why was I expected to absorb his aggression, his disrespect, his need to prove himself at my expense? I told her I needed time. She said she understood, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. Uncle James had a different take. He called me later that week, and his tone was firm but fair. "I'm not saying you were wrong," he said. "But this is tearing the family apart. People are taking sides. It's not good." I appreciated his honesty. He wasn't blaming me, but he was asking me to consider the bigger picture. I told him I'd think about it. And I did. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't about the family. This was about me and Tyler. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. This was about respect, or the lack of it. And I wasn't going to sacrifice my self-respect just to keep the peace. I'd spent too long doing that already. I made a decision. I wasn't going to reach out to Tyler anymore. I wasn't going to try to fix this. If he wanted to rebuild our relationship, he'd have to take the first step. He'd have to acknowledge what he'd done, why it was wrong, and what he planned to do differently. Until then, I was done. I sent him one final message. Short, clear, no room for misinterpretation. I'm done being your support system until there's basic respect. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't expect one. I just needed to say it. For me, not for him. The message sat there unread for 2 days. Then the read receipt appeared. No reply. Just silence. And I was okay with that. Tyler's reaction came a week later, not directly to me, but through other family members. Aunt Marissa called first. Her voice was strained, like she'd been crying. He's really upset, she said. He thinks you hate him. I told her I didn't hate him. I told her I just needed him to respect me. She didn't seem to understand the distinction. He's your cousin, she said. You've known him his whole life. Can't you just talk to him? I explained that I'd tried. I explained that every time I'd set a boundary, he'd ignored it or turned it into a joke. She went quiet, then said, he thinks you're being arrogant. He thinks all of this went to your head. I let that sit for a moment. Arrogant. Because I refused to let him disrespect me. Because I stood up for myself. I'm not arrogant, I said. I'm just done pretending this is okay. Tyler texted me later that day. It was the first time he'd reached out since the barbecue. The message was long, defensive, full of justifications. He said he'd been joking. He said I'd overreacted. He said everyone thought I'd gone too far. He said I was acting like I was better than him just because I was an officer. He said I'd embarrassed him in front of the whole family and he didn't know if he could forgive me. I read the message 3 times. Then I put my phone down and didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't acknowledged what he'd done. He'd just blamed me for his own actions. That told me everything I needed to know. The family pressure intensified. Uncle James called again. This time, his tone was more urgent. You need to fix this, he said. Tyler's struggling. He's not doing well. I asked what he meant. He said Tyler had been pulling back from family events, that he seemed angry all the time, that he'd stopped talking to people. He needs you, Uncle James said. You're the one person who's always been there for him. I felt the weight of that statement. The guilt. The obligation. But I didn't let it move me. He needs to take responsibility, I said. Not me. Uncle James sighed. You're both stubborn. But you're older. You should be the bigger person. I told him I'd been the bigger person for years. I told him I was done. I focused on my squadron. That's where my energy needed to be. I had responsibilities, people who depended on me, missions that mattered. I couldn't let family drama bleed into my professional life. I compartmentalized the way I'd been trained to. Work was work. Family was family. And right now, family was a mess I couldn't fix. My performance didn't slip. If anything, I was more focused than ever. I threw myself into training, into planning, into leadership. Colonel Reeves noticed. She pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was fine. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Good, she said. Because we need you sharp. I appreciated that. She didn't pry. She just reminded me that I had a job to do, and I did it. But I couldn't ignore the guilt completely. There were moments, late at night, when I'd lie awake and wonder if I should have handled things differently. If I should have just let him take his swing, let him feel tough, let him save face. Maybe it would have been easier. Maybe the family would have moved on. But then I'd remember the way he'd looked at me that day. The condescension. The dismissiveness. The certainty that I was less than him. And I'd remember that this wasn't about one moment. This was about years of accumulated disrespect. This was about a relationship that had become one-sided, where I gave and he took and nothing ever changed. I didn't regret what I'd done, but I did regret that it had come to this. Weeks passed. The family stopped talking about it as much. People moved on to other topics, other dramas. But the divide remained. There were people who supported me, who understood why I'd drawn the line. And there were people who thought I'd gone too far, who thought I should have been more forgiving. I stopped trying to convince anyone. I stopped explaining myself. I just existed in the space I'd created, a space where my boundaries were clear and my self-respect was intact. It was lonely sometimes, but it was honest. And I'd learned a long time ago that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is better than pretending everything is fine when it's not. Tyler's life started to crack in ways I only heard about secondhand. Aunt Marissa mentioned he was struggling at his unit. Uncle James said he'd been getting in trouble for minor infractions. A younger cousin told me he'd stopped showing up to family events altogether. I didn't reach out. I didn't intervene. I'd set a boundary and I was going to hold it. This was his journey now. He had to figure out what he wanted, who he wanted to be, and whether he was willing to do the work to repair what he'd broken. I couldn't do that for him. I'd tried for years, and it hadn't worked. The only thing left was to let natural consequences run their course. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And I believed, deep down, that it was the only way he'd ever learn. Tyler's reputation started to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small things I heard through the family grapevine. The younger cousins, the ones who used to look up to him, started teasing him about the barbecue. Not mean-spirited, but the way kids do when they find something funny. Remember when you got choked out by Chelsea? One of them said at a family birthday party I didn't attend. I heard about it later. Tyler had apparently laughed it off, but Aunt Marissa said his face had gone red. The story became a joke, something people brought up when they wanted to get a reaction. And every time it came up, Tyler's image as the tough Marine took another hit. At his unit, things got worse. I didn't hear this directly from him, obviously, but through mutual connections. Tyler had been bragging to other Marines that he'd beat an Air Force officer in a sparring match. He told the story the way he wanted it to go, the way it should have gone in his mind. He painted himself as the victor, me as someone who got lucky or pulled rank or didn't fight fair. But someone fact-checked him. I don't know who. Maybe another Marine who knew someone in the Air Force. Maybe someone who just didn't buy the story. Either way, the truth came out. Tyler had lunged at his cousin, a major with combat training, and gotten put on the ground in seconds. The story spread. Not as a badge of honor, but as a cautionary tale. He became the guy who talked big and couldn't back it up. His peers started distancing themselves. The young Marines he used to hang out with, the ones who'd hyped him up and reinforced his ego, stopped inviting him out. They didn't do it openly. It was subtle. He'd hear about plans after the fact. He'd show up somewhere and realize everyone had already left. That kind of isolation is brutal, especially in the military where camaraderie is everything. Tyler had built his identity on being part of a brotherhood, and now that brotherhood was slipping away. He tried to double down, to prove himself through other means. He volunteered for extra duty. He pushed himself harder in PT. But it didn't change the underlying issue. People didn't trust him. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he'd shown he was willing to lie to protect his ego. I heard he was struggling in MS school. His grades weren't where they needed to be. His instructors had concerns about his attitude. He was defensive, resistant to feedback, quick to blame others when things went wrong. That wasn't the Tyler I grew up with. The Tyler I knew was competitive, sure, but he was also adaptable. He learned from his mistakes. This new version, the one who couldn't admit fault, was someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe it was someone who'd always been there, just hidden under layers of family loyalty and my willingness to excuse his behavior. I didn't know anymore. What I did know was that he was facing consequences I hadn't imposed. These were natural results of his choices. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that he'd chosen pride over growth. One evening, I got a call from Uncle James. His tone was different this time. Quieter. More concerned. Tyler told Marissa he feels embarrassed, he said. Not just about the barbecue. About everything. He said he doesn't know how to fix it. I didn't say anything right away. I was waiting to see where this was going. He won't reach out to you, Uncle James continued. He's too proud. But I think he knows he messed up. I asked if Tyler had actually said that. Uncle James hesitated. Not in those words. But I can tell. I thanked him for letting me know, but I didn't promise anything. Pride was the problem. Tyler's inability to admit he was wrong, to apologize, to take responsibility, that was the core issue. Until he dealt with that, nothing would change. I maintained my stance. No intervention. No reaching out. No smoothing things over. I had a career to focus on, a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's emotions. I worked long hours, led my team, trained hard. I went to the gym at 05:30 every morning, ran 5 miles, then spent an hour on hand-to-hand drills. Not because I was preparing for another confrontation, but because discipline kept me grounded. It gave me structure when everything else felt chaotic. I had dinner with Lydia once a week, and we'd talk about work, life, the challenges of being women in leadership roles in the military. She never brought up Tyler unless I did. I appreciated that. Months passed. The family barbecues and gatherings continued, but I noticed Tyler wasn't at most of them. Aunt Marissa would make excuses. He's working. He had duty. He's not feeling well. I didn't press. I showed up, ate, talked to relatives, and went home. People stopped asking me about the incident. It became old news, something that had happened and been absorbed into the family's collective history. A few relatives still looked at me differently. A few still thought I'd been too harsh. But most had moved on. Life kept going. That's what life does. It keeps moving whether you're ready or not. I thought about Tyler sometimes. Wondered if he was okay. Wondered if he'd learned anything. Wondered if he'd ever reach out. But I didn't let those thoughts consume me. I'd done what I needed to do. I'd set a boundary, held it, and refused to compromise my self-respect for the sake of someone who didn't value it. That was the right choice. I believed that. Even when it was hard. Even when it was lonely. Even when I questioned whether I'd lost something irreplaceable. Because the truth was, what we'd had, the closeness, the bond, had been eroding for years. I'd just been the last one to admit it. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their actions. Not out of cruelty, but out of hope. Hope that they'll learn. Hope that they'll grow. Hope that one day, they'll become the person they're capable of being. Even if you're not there to see it. The first sign that something had shifted came 6 months after the barbecue. I was at the grocery store, pushing a cart through the produce section, when my phone buzzed. A text from Tyler. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long moment, my hand frozen on a bag of apples. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part wanted to respond immediately. I did neither. I finished my shopping, drove home, put the groceries away, and then sat on my couch with my phone in my hand. I read the message again. Can we talk? Not a demand. Not an excuse. Just a question. I typed back when. His response came fast. Whenever works for you. I can drive up this weekend if that's okay. I told him Saturday at 10:00 hours. He agreed. Saturday came. I cleaned my apartment, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I made coffee, set out 2 mugs, and waited. At exactly 10:00, there was a knock on my door. I opened it. Tyler stood there in civilian clothes, jeans and a plain t-shirt, hands in his pockets. He looked different. Thinner. Tired. His eyes didn't have that cocky gleam anymore. Hey, he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat on the couch, and I sat in the chair across from him. We didn't hug. We didn't do the usual family greeting. This wasn't that kind of visit. I handed him a mug of coffee. He took it, nodded thanks, and held it between his hands like he needed something to anchor himself. I was out of line, he said. No preamble. No justification. Just that. I waited. At the barbecue. Before that. For a long time, honestly. He looked down at his coffee, not at me. I wanted to impress people. I wanted to feel like I mattered. And I thought the way to do that was to make you seem smaller. He paused. That was wrong. I stayed quiet. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because he needed to say this. All of it. I didn't see you, he continued. I didn't see everything you'd done for me. The help. The support. I just took it. And then I acted like I didn't need it. Like I'd done it all myself. He finally looked up at me. I'm sorry. I took a sip of my coffee. Let the silence stretch. Then I said, why now? He frowned, confused. Why are you apologizing now? I clarified. He shifted in his seat. Because I've been miserable. Because I lost friends. Because I realized I was turning into someone I didn't want to be. He exhaled slowly. And because I miss you. Not the version of you I made up in my head, where you were less than me. The real you. The person who actually gave a damn about me. I nodded. That was honest. Messy, but honest. You provoked that whole thing, I said. You lunged at me in front of the entire family. You wanted to humiliate me. And when it didn't work, you blamed me for defending myself." He nodded. "I know. I was an idiot." "You were worse than an idiot," I said. "You were disrespectful. You dismissed everything I'd accomplished. You treated my rank like a joke. You acted like I didn't deserve the things I'd earned." My voice stayed calm, but I didn't soften the words. He needed to hear them. "I get it," he said quietly. "I was jealous. I saw you as a major, as someone with authority and respect, and I was still a PFC trying to prove I belonged. It made me feel small. So I tried to make you feel small too." He looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the cousin I used to know. Not the arrogant Marine. Not the kid trying too hard. Just Tyler. "That was wrong," he said. "And I'm sorry." I believed him. I didn't forgive him yet, not completely, but I believed he was sorry. "Here's the thing," I said. "I can accept your apology. But that doesn't mean things go back to how they were." He nodded. "I know. I'm not your support system anymore," I continued. "I'm not the person who fixes things for you or covers for you or lets things slide because we're family. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be different. It has to be built on respect. Real respect, not just words." He set his coffee down on the table. "I understand. And I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I have to prove it." I appreciated that. He wasn't asking for instant forgiveness. He wasn't asking me to pretend nothing had happened. He was acknowledging the damage and accepting that rebuilding would take time. We talked for another hour. Not about the barbecue, but about everything else. What had been happening in his life? What had been happening in mine? He told me about struggling at MS school, about the isolation he'd felt, about realizing that bragging and bravado didn't earn respect. I told him about my work, about the challenges of leadership, about the decisions I'd had to make that didn't have easy answers. We didn't try to force closeness. We just talked, like two people getting to know each other again. When he left, I walked him to the door. He turned before he stepped out. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he said. I nodded. "Don't waste it." He said he wouldn't. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, exactly. More like cautious hope. Over the next few weeks, Tyler and I communicated occasionally. Texts mostly. Short updates. He told me he'd started seeing someone at his unit about anger and ego issues. He told me he was working on taking feedback better. I didn't offer advice unless he asked. I didn't try to guide him. This was his work to do, not mine. Slowly, very slowly, things improved. Not back to how they were. That version of our relationship was gone. But something new started to form. An adult-to-adult connection, built on honesty instead of obligation. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where I could see the old patterns trying to resurface. But he caught himself more often than not. And when he didn't, I called it out. Not harshly, but clearly. And he listened. The family noticed the shift. Aunt Marissa called me one day, her voice lighter than it had been in months. "Thank you," she said. I asked what for. For giving him another chance. I know it wasn't easy. I told her it wasn't about easy. It was about whether he was willing to change. And so far, he seemed to be trying. She said she'd noticed too. That he was different. Quieter, but in a good way. More thoughtful. Less performative. I was glad to hear it. Not for me, but for him. Because he deserved better than the person he'd been becoming. And now, maybe, he had a chance to figure out who that better person was. 2 years have passed since the barbecue. I'm still a major, though I've been selected for lieutenant colonel and I'm waiting on my promotion board results. My career is stable, fulfilling, exactly where I want it to be. I work with a good team, I'm respected by my peers and subordinates, and I'm building the kind of legacy I can be proud of. Colonel Reeves retired last year, and I spoke at her ceremony. She told me afterward that I reminded her of herself at my age, focused, principled, unwilling to compromise on the things that mattered. I took that as the compliment it was. I've learned a lot from her over the years. How to lead with integrity. How to set boundaries without apology. How to navigate the complexities of a career where being a woman often means working twice as hard for half the recognition. Tyler is still enlisted. He's a corporal now, E4, which means he's progressing. Not as fast as some, but steadily. He's more mature than he was 2 years ago. Less performative. More grounded. We talk occasionally, maybe once a month. He asks about my work sometimes, and I ask about his. It's not the closeness we had as kids, but it's something real. Something built on mutual respect rather than obligation or nostalgia. He's in a healthier place, both mentally and professionally. He's learning to take feedback without getting defensive. He's building real relationships with his peers instead of trying to impress them. I'm proud of him for that, even if I don't say it often. The family has moved on. The barbecue incident is rarely mentioned anymore. When it does come up, it's usually as a cautionary tale told by Uncle James to younger cousins. Don't start something you're not ready to finish, he'll say, half joking. Tyler laughs about it now, which is a good sign. He's not ashamed of it, but he's not defensive either. He owns it. That's growth. Aunt Marissa still worries about him, the way mothers do, but she's less anxious than she used to be. She sees that he's finding his way, even if it's taking longer than she'd hoped. And she's stopped asking me to fix things for him, which I appreciate. She understands now that Tyler's journey is his own. I think about boundaries a lot. How necessary they are. How uncomfortable they can be to enforce. How easy it is to let people cross them, especially people you love, because holding the line feels cruel. But boundaries aren't cruel. They're clarifying. They tell people what's acceptable and what isn't. They protect your energy, your self-respect, your peace. I didn't choke Tyler out to hurt him. I choked him out to stop him. And the real lesson, the one that took months to unfold, wasn't about the chokehold. It was about the boundary I set afterward. The decision to step back, to stop enabling, to stop sacrificing my dignity for the sake of family harmony. That's what created the real change. The chokehold was just a moment. The boundary was a choice. Lydia and I still meet for coffee once a week. She got promoted to major last year, and we celebrated quietly over dinner. She's been a steady presence in my life, someone who understands the unique challenges of our careers, the weight of leadership, the isolation that sometimes comes with being a woman in a male-dominated field. We talk about work, about life, about the choices we make and the consequences we live with. She reminds me, when I need it, that I did the right thing with Tyler. That standing up for myself wasn't selfish. That boundaries aren't punishments. They're protection. I'm grateful for her honesty, her perspective, her friendship. The lesson I've learned through all of this is simple, but it took a long time to internalize. You can't force people to respect you. You can't reason them into it or prove your way into it. Respect is something people choose to give, and if they don't choose it, no amount of effort on your part will change that. The only thing you can control is how you respond. You can set boundaries. You can walk away. You can refuse to tolerate disrespect, even from people you love. Especially from people you love. Because love without respect isn't really love. It's obligation. It's habit. It's history. But it's not connection. And I'd rather have an honest, respectful relationship with someone, even if it's distant, than a close relationship built on disrespect and resentment. Tyler and I will probably never be as close as we were as kids. That version of our relationship is gone, and I don't mourn it. It was based on dynamics that weren't healthy, on me always giving and him always taking. What we have now is better. It's honest. It's equal. It's built on respect. And if it stays that way, I'll be glad. If it doesn't, if he slips back into old patterns, I'll walk away again. Because I know now that I can. That I don't owe anyone access to my life if they're going to use it to diminish me. That's not cruelty. That's self-preservation. And there's nothing wrong with that. Justice came quietly in the end. Not through the chokehold, though that was the moment everyone remembers. Justice came through consequences. Through Tyler having to face the fallout of his actions without me there to soften the blow. Through him realizing that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. Through the slow, painful process of him becoming a better version of himself. I didn't have to punish him. Life did that. I just had to step back and let it happen. And in stepping back, I found clarity. Clarity about who I am, what I deserve, and what I'm willing to tolerate. That clarity has shaped everything since. My career, my relationships, my sense of self. I'm a better leader because of it. A better friend. A better person. And if that's what came out of one of the hardest periods of my life, then maybe it was worth it. 12 years have passed since the barbecue. I'm 44 now, a lieutenant colonel with 16 years of active duty service behind me. The promotion to O5 came when I was 36, right on schedule, and I've spent the last 8 years in positions of increasing responsibility. I command a squadron now, 320 airmen under my leadership, and the weight of that responsibility is something I carry every day. Not as a burden, but as a privilege. These are people's lives, people's careers, and every decision I make ripples outward in ways I can't always predict. Colonel Reeves taught me that. She told me once, years before she retired, that leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about being consistent, fair, and willing to admit when you're wrong. I've tried to live by that. My career has taken me places I never expected. I spent 2 years at the Pentagon, working in force development and strategic planning. I hated the politics, but learned how decisions get made at the highest levels. I deployed twice more, once to the Middle East and once to the Pacific Theater, both times in advisory roles that required more diplomacy than combat readiness. I've briefed generals, testified before congressional subcommittees, and represented the Air Force at joint service conferences. None of it was glamorous. Most of it was exhausting. But all of it mattered. I'm being considered for full colonel now, 06, and if that promotion comes through, I'll be one step away from the senior leadership I never imagined reaching when I was a second lieutenant fresh out of ROTC. Tyler is 31 now. He's a staff sergeant in the Marines, E6, which means he's climbed steadily through the enlisted ranks. He's married, has a 2-year-old daughter named Emma, and from what I can tell through our occasional conversations and the photos Aunt Marissa shares, he's built a good life. He's stationed at Camp Pendleton now, working as an instructor for new Marines going through combat training. He tells me he likes the teaching aspect, that it feels meaningful in ways his earlier assignments didn't. He's grown into someone I respect, not just tolerate. The arrogance that defined him at 19 is gone, replaced by something quieter and more solid. He's learned what I knew at 23, that real strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when it's needed. We see each other maybe twice a year now. Family gatherings mostly. Thanksgiving at Uncle James's house. Christmas at Aunt Marissa's. The interactions are comfortable, easy in a way they weren't for a long time after everything that happened. We talk about our kids. I have a 7-year-old son named Marcus from a marriage that ended 3 years ago, and about work in the broad, vague way that military people do when they can't discuss specifics. We laugh about things our kids do, compare notes on how exhausting parenthood is, and avoid the past unless it comes up naturally. And when it does come up, it's not with tension or resentment. It's just history. Something that happened, something we both learned from, something that shaped who we became. Last Thanksgiving, Tyler and I ended up in the kitchen together, away from the noise of the living room where kids were running around and adults were arguing about football. He was washing dishes and I was drying them, an easy rhythm we'd fallen into without discussing it. You know, he said, not looking at me, his hands submerged in soapy water. I think about that day a lot. I didn't have to ask which day. Yeah, I said, drying a plate and setting it on the counter. He nodded. I was such an idiot. I didn't disagree. You were 19, I said. 19-year-olds are idiots. He laughed, a short, self-deprecating sound. I was worse than most. He pulled a pot out of the water, scrubbed it harder than necessary. I wanted to be you. That's what it was. I wanted the respect you had, the authority, the way people listened when you talked. And I didn't know how to earn it, so I tried to tear you down instead. I set the towel down and looked at him. You could have just asked me how I got there. He glanced at me, then back at the pot. I know, but that would have required me admitting I didn't already know everything. He rinsed the pot, handed it to me. I tell my Marines now, the young ones who come in thinking they're invincible, that confidence without competence is just arrogance. And that arrogance will get you hurt or worse, get someone else hurt. I dried the pot slowly, considering his words. That's a good lesson, I said. He nodded. I learned it from you. The hard way. We finished the dishes in silence, and when we walked back into the living room, something felt settled between us. Not resolved, because it had been resolved years ago. Just settled. Like we'd both finally let go of the last bit of weight we'd been carrying. My son Marcus asks about Uncle Tyler sometimes. He's at the age where he's fascinated by the military, by the idea of being tough and brave and strong. He sees Tyler's uniform when he visits and asks if Uncle Tyler has ever been in a fight. I tell him that being in the military isn't about fighting. It's about discipline, service, and doing your job even when it's hard. Marcus doesn't quite understand that yet, but he will. Tyler is good with him, patient in a way I wouldn't have expected from the 19-year-old version of him. He lets Marcus try on his cover, shows him how to stand at attention, explains the different ribbons on his dress uniform. And when Marcus asks if Uncle Tyler could beat me in a fight, Tyler laughs and says, "Your mom would have me on the ground before I knew what hit me." Marcus thinks that's the funniest thing he's ever heard. The divorce from Marcus's father was hard, but necessary. David was a good man, a civilian contractor I met during my time at the Pentagon, but we wanted different things. He wanted stability, routine, a partner who was home for dinner every night. I wanted a career that mattered, deployments that challenged me, a life that didn't fit into a predictable pattern. We tried for 3 years to make it work, went to counseling, had long conversations about compromise and sacrifice. But in the end, we both realized we were compromising too much of who we were. The divorce was amicable. We co-parent well. Marcus spends half the week with me and half with David, and we make it work because we both love our son more than we resent each other. It's not the life I imagined when I was younger, but it's a good life. Honest. Real. Built on choices I made consciously rather than defaulting to what I thought I was supposed to want. Aunt Marissa is 60 now, still the family's emotional center. She retired from teaching 2 years ago and spends most of her time with Tyler's daughter Emma, who she adores. She's softer now than she was 12 years ago, less anxious, more accepting of the way things turned out. She told me once, about a year after Tyler and I started rebuilding our relationship, that she'd been wrong to ask me to let things go. "You knew what he needed," she said. "I was just trying to protect him from being hurt. But you were protecting him from something worse, from never growing up." I appreciated that. It took courage for her to say it, to admit she'd misread the situation. Uncle James is 62, semi-retired from his contracting business, still the family patriarch in all the ways that matter. He hosts the gatherings, mediates the disputes, and keeps everyone connected. He's proud of both Tyler and me in different ways. He tells people his niece is a lieutenant colonel and his nephew is a staff sergeant, and you can hear the pride in his voice when he says it. Lydia is a lieutenant colonel now too, stationed in Colorado Springs working at Northcom. We don't see each other as often as we used to, but we talk every few weeks, long phone calls where we catch up on work and life and everything in between. She got married 4 years ago to another officer, a woman named Rachel who works in intelligence. They're happy, stable, building the kind of partnership I tried to build with David but couldn't quite manage. I'm happy for her. She deserves it. She's still one of the smartest, most capable officers I know, and I've told her more than once that she's going to make general before she retires. She laughs when I say it, but I mean it. She has the vision, the leadership skills, and the political savvy that senior leadership requires. I have some of those things, but not all of them. I'm better in operational roles, in the field, leading people directly rather than managing from a distance. I think about the barbecue sometimes. Not often, but when I do, it's with a strange mix of emotions. Regret that it happened the way it did. Gratitude for what came after. The incident itself was brief, maybe 30 seconds from Tyler lunging to him tapping out. But the aftermath stretched for years. The silence. The boundaries. The slow, painful work of rebuilding. If I could go back, I don't know what I'd change. Maybe I would have walked away instead of engaging. Maybe I would have pulled Tyler aside before things escalated and had a hard conversation in private. But maybe not. Maybe it needed to happen exactly the way it did. Maybe Tyler needed to be humbled publicly because private conversations hadn't worked. Maybe I needed to draw that line so clearly that there was no ambiguity, no room for him to misinterpret or minimize what had happened. The younger generation in our family doesn't know the full story. They know there was an incident at a barbecue years ago, something about sparring that went wrong, but the details have faded into family lore. That's fine with me. I'm not interested in relitigating it or explaining myself to people who weren't there. Tyler and I have moved on. The family has moved on. And the people who matter, the ones who were actually there and saw what happened, understand. Some of them understood immediately. Some took years. A few probably still think I overreacted. I've made peace with that. You can't control how people interpret your actions, especially when those actions challenge their assumptions about who you're supposed to be. I've trained hundreds of airmen over the years. Young men and women who come into the Air Force with all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of motivations. Some are there for college money. Some are there because they didn't know what else to do. Some are there because they genuinely want to serve. I try to teach them the same things Colonel Reeves taught me. Discipline isn't about being rigid. It's about being consistent. Leadership isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about being the most reliable. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, day after day, in ways that no one might notice until it matters. I tell them about mistakes I've made, decisions I regret, moments where I let my ego get in the way of doing the right thing. I don't tell them about Tyler. That story is too personal, too specific. But the lessons from it show up in everything I teach. Marcus asked me last month what the hardest thing I've ever done was. We were driving home from his soccer practice, stuck in traffic, and he was in one of those moods where he asks big questions out of nowhere. I thought about it for a while. Deployments were hard. Losing friends in training accidents was hard. The divorce was hard. But the hardest thing? Setting a boundary with someone I loved, I said. He looked at me confused. What's a boundary? I tried to explain it in terms a 7-year-old would understand. It's when you tell someone what's okay and what's not okay, and you stick to it even when it's uncomfortable. He thought about that. Like when I tell Jack he can't borrow my toys without asking? I smiled. Exactly like that. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking out the window. I wondered if he'd remember that conversation when he was older, if it would mean something to him then that it couldn't mean now. Tyler's daughter Emma is too, all energy and curiosity and fearlessness. She reminds me of Tyler at that age, always moving, always testing limits. I wonder what kind of person she'll become. Whether she'll inherit her father's competitiveness or her mother's patience or some combination of both. Whether she'll join the military like her dad and her aunt or reject it entirely and choose something completely different. I hope, whatever she chooses, that Tyler and his wife raise her with the tools to handle failure, to admit when she's wrong, to ask for help when she needs it. Those are the things Tyler didn't have at 19. Those are the things that made everything so much harder than it needed to be. I've been thinking about retirement lately. Not immediately. I've got at least 6 more years before I hit 20, and I want to see if the 6 promotion comes through. But eventually. What comes after? I've spent my entire adult life in the Air Force. It's given me structure, purpose, identity. It's also taken a lot. Time with family. Stability in relationships. The ability to put down roots anywhere. I don't regret it. I chose this life knowing what it would cost. But I'm starting to think about what the next chapter looks like. Maybe teaching at a military academy. Maybe consulting for defense contractors. Maybe something completely unrelated to the military, something I haven't even considered yet. The future feels open in a way it hasn't in years. Tyler and I had a conversation last Christmas that stayed with me. We were outside, away from the noise of the house, standing in Uncle James's backyard while snow fell quietly around us. Emma was inside with Aunt Marissa, Marcus was playing video games with Tyler's younger stepbrother, and we'd both needed a break from the chaos. You ever regret how things went down? Tyler asked, his breath visible in the cold air. I knew what he meant. No, I said. Do you? He thought about it. I regret how I acted. I don't regret what happened after. I needed it. I just wish I'd figured it out without putting you through all that. I looked at him, at the man he'd become, and felt something close to pride. Not the kind of pride that says I fixed him, because I didn't. He fixed himself. But the kind of pride that comes from watching someone you love grow into someone worth respecting. You know what I learned from all of it? I said. He looked at me, waiting. That you can love someone and still set boundaries. That you can care about someone and still refuse to tolerate disrespect. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face consequences. He nodded slowly. I teach my Marines that now. I tell them that accountability isn't punishment. It's growth. We stood there for a while longer, not saying anything, just existing in the quiet. The snow kept falling, covering everything in clean white. When we finally went back inside, the house was warm and loud and full of family. Tyler's wife was laughing at something Uncle James said. Aunt Marissa was reading a book to Emma. Marcus was showing David something on his phone. It was messy and imperfect and real. And I realized, standing in the doorway watching all of it, that this was what justice looked like. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just people learning to be better, making space for each other to grow, building relationships based on respect instead of obligation. Tyler caught my eye from across the room and raised his beer bottle slightly. I raised my glass of wine back. A silent acknowledgement of how far we'd both come. Of the years it took to get here. Of the work that's still ahead. Because growth doesn't have an endpoint. It's not something you achieve and then you're done. It's something you commit to every day in ways both big and small. Tyler's learned that. I've learned that. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll pass those lessons on to the next generation. To Marcus and Emma and whoever else comes after. Not through lectures or dramatic moments, but through example. Through the way we treat each other. Through the boundaries we set and the respect we show. Through the quiet, unglamorous work of becoming people worthy of the trust others place in us. That's the real legacy. Not ranks or ribbons or stories people tell at family gatherings. But the steady, consistent choice to be better today than we were yesterday. And the grace to forgive ourselves and each other when we fall short. And that's how one backyard sparring match forced a hard reset on a lifetime of imbalance. I didn't plan to teach Tyler a lesson, but I wasn't going to let him walk all over me either. What about you? Have you ever had to set a boundary with family even when everyone told you to just let it go? Did someone ever underestimate you only to learn the hard way? Or have you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? Drop your story below. I read every comment. If you got something out of this, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that strength doesn't always look the way people expect.